Erev Tov Rabotai, we're continuing with our Mishna Yomi Masechet Kilayim. We're up to Perek Gimel Mishnah Vav. The Mishnah now is going to discuss the procedure for planting rows of gourd in a field of onions. Now the Mefarshim point out that when we speak about a field of onions, it's not being specific onions, it's giving an example. The same would be true for a field of any other kind of vegetable. That's how the Rambam explains it in his commentary of the Mishnah. Likewise, when we say planting rows of gourd, it's because gourds have a special problem. Their leaves spread out over the adjoining areas, like we saw in Mishnah Dalid. The Mishnah's halakha is going to equally apply to the other two species mentioned there, which are the cucumbers and Egyptian beans. This is how the Aruch Shulchan and the Chazon Ish explain it. So let us see the Mishnah. If a person's field was planted with onions, and he wants to plant rows of gourd in it, what should he do? So you have a field with onions and you want to plant rows of gourd. So the Mishnah gives three opinions. The first opinion, Rabbi Ishmael says, you uproot 2 rows of onions, making a space 8 amot wide. And the Mefarshim explain, a row of gourd is 4 amot wide. Now, in order to make room for a row of gourd this size, 4 amot wide, you have to uproot the equivalent of 2 such rows of onions. Meaning, the Rav says, you have to uproot the onions from a strip 8 amot wide, because it takes 1 row of gourd is 4 amot, but you want to make a 8 amot separation. And then you plant 1 row of gourd, which is 4 amot wide in the center of this clearing. So what do you have? If you only planted 4 amot and you have 8, that leaves 2 empty amot on each side of the road that separates the gourds from the onion on either side of it. So you have 2 rows of onions, 2 amot separation, 4 amot of the gourd, 2 amot separation, and then again the 2 rows of the onions. If you can look at the diagram in the art scroll, it makes it very clear. And then he leaves the standing he leaves standing the onions that are in a place fit for 2 rows, meaning he leaves the next 8 amot of onions growing in their place. The Mishnah is calling it 2 rows because this is the size of 2 rows of gourds, but really he's talking about 1 strip of onions. And then again you uproot the next 2 rows, meaning you make a space that's 8 amot wide, and you plant 1 row of gourds, which is 4 amot wide, because then you have the onion, 2 amot separation, 4 amot gourd, 2 amot separation, and again, and you continue this pattern throughout the field. So what do you end up having? You end up having a field with alternating 8 amot wide rows of onions, followed by a 2 amot gap, a 4 amot wide row of gourds, and then another 2 amot gap, and then another 8 amot row of onions. So you have each strip of gourd is separated from any other strip of gourd by 12 amot, because you have the 2 gap, plus the 8, which is the onions, plus the 2 gap, which is 12. And that is the first opinion of the Mishnah. Rabbi Akiva Omer, the second opinion the Mishnah brings is Rabbi Akiva, who says, you uproot 2 rows of onions. Again, it's not really 2 rows, it's the 1 row, which is 8 amot wide. And you plant 2 rows of gourd in the place, filling up the 8 amot that you cleared because you're uprooting 8 amot. You don't have to leave a 2 amot gap. That's how Rabbi Akiva differs. Now, Rabbi Ishmael required 2 stringencies, a 2 amot gap, 12 tvachim, between the gourds and the onions, instead of the usual 6 tvachim that you have to have between vegetables, and also a distance of 12 amot between the rows of the gourds. The 2 amot gap, Rabbi Ishmael said you have because the gourd leaves spread out and they make a smaller separation hard to notice, like we saw in Mishnah Dalid. The 12 amot distance that Rabbi Ishmael requires between the rows of the gourd, he requires it in order for them to maintain their status as individual rows. If they would be closer, they would combine with each other to be considered a field of gourds. If you have a field of gourds that overlap a field of onions, it's considered Kilayim. However, a row inside a field does not look like Kilayim if it has the proper separation, but a field inside a field does look like Kilayim even with the proper separation. That's how the Rambam explains Rabbi Ishmael. The Rav learns a little differently. However, according to Rabbi Akiva, you have to leave a gap. According to Rabbi Akiva, you uproot 2 rows of onions, and then you plant 2 rows of gourds in their place, filling up the 8 amot that you cleared, but you don't have to leave a 2 amot gap. You leave the gap of 6 tvachim, like the law by every other separation of vegetables, but not like Rabbi Ishmael, who required 12 tvachim. And then you leave standing the onions that are in a place fit for 2 rows, meaning you leave the next 8 amot of onions growing in their place. V'oker shtei shurot, and you uproot the next 2 rows of onions. V'noter shtei shurot, then you plant 2 rows of gourds in their place, and you continue the pattern throughout the field. According to Rabbi Akiva, the difference is you don't have to have the 2 amma gap between the gourds and the onions. It's enough for the rows of gourd to be separated by just 8 amot. And again, the Mefarshim point out, Rabbi Akiva disagrees with Rabbi Shmuel on 2 counts. First of all, Rabbi Akiva says you don't have to leave 2 amot between the onions and the gourds. 6 tfachim is enough. Second of all, you don't have to leave a distance of 12 amot between the rows of gourd. 8 amot is enough to prevent them to be considered a field. Now, if you look at the diagram, it comes out very well. You have 2 rows of gourds, then the 8 amot, 2 rows of onions. They're separated by 6 by 6 tfachim, and then 2 rows of gourds again. And Rabbi Akiva says that is enough. After that, after you have the 6 tefachim separation, they can already narrow in the shape of a corner until they come to the point at the end of the field, as long as they are separated by 6 tefachim. The third opinion is the Chachamim. The Chachamim omrim, the sages say, Im en ben shura lechaverta 12 amma, if there are less than 12 amot of space between 1 row of gourds and its neighbor, lo yikayem et hazera shel bentayim, he may not keep the onion plants in between them. And the Mefarshim explain that the Chachamim agree with Rabbi Shmuel that 12 amot are needed to separate between 1 row of gourds and the next, but they agree with Rabbi Akiva, they do not have to leave the 2 amma gap between the gourds and the onions. The Mefarshim explain that the Chachamim agree with Rabbi Shmuel that the 12 amot have to separate the individual rows of gourd from one another for them not to be considered like a field. However, they disagree with them. They say you don't have to have 12 tefachim. You do not have to have, 12 tefachim. Yes, you do not have to have 12 tefachim to separate between the gourds from the onions. It's enough to have 6 tefachim to separate a row of gourds from a field of onions, just like it works to separate any other vegetable that is planted inside a field of vegetables. Therefore, according to the Chachamim, you have to leave the equivalent of 3 rows of onions growing between rows of gourd. And in summary, the way the article summarizes this Mishnah is like this. A row of gourds is permitted in a field of onions, provided there is a proper separation between it and the onions. 2 amot according to Rabbi Shmuel, 6 tefachim according to Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim. However, when you have 2 rows of gourds, that's only permitted in a field of onions only if the rows of gourd are far enough from each other not to make a field of their own, which 12 amot according to Rabbi Shmuel and the Chachamim, 8 amot according to Rabbi Akiva. That's because the fields intermingled with each other are asur, even if their individual sections are separated by the distances that we said. That is in Rabotai Mishnah Vav. Again, I encourage to look at the diagrams. When you look at the diagrams and you see the Mishnah, it makes it much more clear. Now, Rabotai, Mishnah Zayin continues with the laws of Kilayim regarding gourds. Dilat biyarak biyarak kiyarak. Dilat biyarak biyarak kiyarak. A Greek gourd planted next to a vegetable field is like any other kind of vegetable planted next to a field of different vegetables, meaning you have to separate the 2 by a gap of 6 tefachim. Now, the Mefarshim point out that the leaves of the Greek gourds are bigger and become more thickly entangled with the leaves of the neighboring vegetables than the leaves of other gourds. However, the Mishnah tells us, even in this case of the Greek gourd, a separation of 6 tefachim is enough. And if you want to plant this Greek gourd next to a grain field, you have to give it a betrova of separation, the same like any other vegetable planted next to a grain field. A betrova we saw in chapter 2, Mishnah 10, is 10.2 amot by 10.2 amot, or 10 amot by 2.5 tefachim by 10 amot. See over there in the Mishnayot. Now, the Mishnah is going to teach that rows of gourds planted in a grain field is treated more leniently. If his field was planted with grain, and he wanted to plant inside of this grain field a row of Greek gourds, we give it 6 tefachim for its work area, meaning 6 tefachim we give to serve as a separation. A gap of 6 tefachim you leave between the row of the gourds and the grain. When we say work area, the Mefarshim point out, we're referring to the empty space next to the planted area where the farmer stands while he does the work. The Mishnah uses this term of work area to describe the area that has to be left empty to separate between the species. Like we're going to see later on in chapter 4, Mishnah 1, the work area is considered part of the planted area. That's why we cannot plant one species in the work area of the other. So you have to leave a gap of 6 tefachim between the row of gourds and the grain. Now, even though a single gourd has to be separated from a field of grain by betrova, a row of gourd, even though a single gourd you have to separate by a betrova in a field of grain, a row of gourds only has to be separated by 6 tvachim, because a row looks more like a place in its own right, and therefore more separate from the field around it. However, when you have a single gourd, it looks like something that got mixed into the field, even when it's 6 tvachim away, therefore you have to separate it by a betrova. The Mefarshim do point out a contradiction. We learned earlier in chapter 2, Mishnah 10, that a row of vegetables in a field of grain has to be separated by a betrova, not just 6 tvachim, whereas here the Mishnah is saying that if you have a row of gourds planted in a field of grain, you only need 6 tvachim. Now, the Mefarshim answer that the Mishnah over there is speaking about a row that is square. But our Mishnah is speaking about a row that is rectangular, meaning longer than it's wide. The Chachamim were stricter with a square than by a rectangle, and they required a greater separation for squares than for rectangles. Therefore, a square row of vegetables in a field of grain needs a betrova, whereas a rectangular row needs only a separation of 6 tvachim. However, the Mefarshim point out, even a rectangular row has to have a 6 tvachim separation for a length of 10.5 amot, which is the length of a betrova. That implies that the leniency of allowing a rectangular row to be separated from a field of grain by just 6 tvachim was set only for a row that is 10.5 amot long. See the Chazon Ish that the Art School brings down to explain more. Now, the Mishnah continues, Vim higdila, if the row of gourds afterwards grew larger and the leaves spread into the 6 tefach gap, Yaakov milefana, you have to uproot the grain in front of it to maintain the 6 tvachim gap, meaning when the leaves of the gourd grow until they reach the grain or the leaves have to be removed to maintain the 6 tefach gap. Rabbi Yossi says, we must give it 4 amot for its work area to serve as a separation, meaning Rabbi Yossi says a gap of 4 amot has to be left between the row of the gourds and the grain, meaning we know there are 6 tvachim in an amah. So Rabbi Yossi's measure is 4 times the 6 tefach required by the Tanakama, because he says you have to leave 4 amot. Amru lo, the Chachamim said to Rabbi Yossi, Hatachmir zo min hagefen. Are you going to treat this case of gourds in a field of grain stricter than we treat a row of grapevines? Meaning, we know that the law for Kilayim is stricter for grapevines than anything else. And the Mefarshim point out, when grapevines are planted in such a way that they are considered a vineyard, they are subject stricter to the laws of Kilayim of the vineyard. Meaning, not only is it asur to plant any other species which within 4 amot of them, but also if something was planted there, both it and the grapes become asur to eat or have benefit from. However, the law of Kilayim for other species is that while you cannot plant it or maintain it, it does not become forbidden to benefit or to eat from. So if the law of Kilayim is stricter for grapevines than anything else, and we know that a single row of grapevines does not have to be separated from other species more than six tvachim, how do you require a 4 amah separation for a single row of gourds? You are making it stricter, and the Mefarshim point out, the Rav says, later on in chapter 4, Mishnah 5, we're going to see a machloket between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, whether a single row of a grapevine is considered a vineyard. Beit Hillel holds it is not a vineyard, so we only need a distance of 6 tvachim between this single row of the grapevine and another species that you plant next to it. If by a grapevine, which is very strict, you only need a separation of 6 tvachim, how can you require here 4 amot and be stricter by grain? Amar len, Rabbi Yossi said to the Chachamim, Matzinu shezo chamura min hagefen. We see that the law for gourd is stricter in some ways than the law for grapevine. How? Because for a single grapevine, we give just 6 tvachim of its work area to serve as a separation from a field of grain. But by a single gourd, we require betrova, like we learned in the beginning of the Mishnah, meaning the law that requiring a betrova of separation from a field of grain was an old ruling, and Rabbi Yossi knew that the Chachamim accepted it. So he argued to the Chachamim, since even you agree that a single gourd requires more spacing from grain, a betrova, than a single grapevine, 6 tvachim, it should not surprise you, it should make sense that a row of gourd planted in a field of grain also requires a greater separation, 4 amot, than a single row of grapevine, 6 tvachim, meaning you already agree that you need a betrova separation, so obviously you see that it's stricter. Now, both Rabbi Yossi and the Chachamim agree that a separation of a betrova is enough for a single gourd planted next to a field of grain. The Mishnah now is going to bring a Tana who disagrees. Rabbi Meir Omer Mishum Rabbi Ishmael. Rabbi Meir says the name of Rabbi Ishmael. Whenever there are 3 gourds in a bet se'ah, an area of 50 by 50 amot, you cannot bring other seeds into this bet se'ah. And the Mefarshim point out, according to Rabbi Meir, you have to leave an empty space of 1/3 of a bet se'ah around the gourd before being able to plant another species there. So if there are 3 gourds spread out in a bet se'ah, no other species are allowed to be planted in it. That's how the Rav explains it. You see that the separation of the bet rova being enough for a single gourd next to a field of grain is argued by Rabbi Meir. Another version brought down of Rabbi Ishmael's opinion, Rabbi Yossi ben Achotef Efrati Amar Mishum Rabbi Ishmael. Rabbi Yossi ben Achotef said, Achotef Efrasi said in the name of Rabbi Ishmael, whenever there are 3 gourds in a bet kur, meaning 30 bet se'ah, you cannot bring other seeds into the bet kur. And the Mefarshim explain that the Yerushalmi explains Rabbi Ishmael originally said what Rabbi Meir quotes him as saying. However, later in his life, Rabbi Ishmael changed his mind. The version the Mishnah is citing now is Rabbi Ishmael's later opinion. According to a different reading of the Yerushalmi, Rabbi Meir's quote of Rabbi Ishmael is his later opinion. The one that is being taught now is his earlier view. So it's either he said it before or after. But again, the Rav does point out that we do not know why Rabbi Ishmael requires such a large separation around a gourd, but nevertheless you see that Rabbi Ishmael, either in the name of Rabbi Meir or in the name of, quoted by Rabbi Yossi ben Achotef Efrati, but they both say that Rabbi Ishmael is arguing on Rabbi Yossi and the Chachamim that a separation of a betrova is enough for a single gourd planted next to a field of grain. That is the end of today's Mishna Yomi, Rabotai. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, Amen v'Amen.